First, good morning to everyone. It's fun to be out here. They normally don't let me out of my office, so it's great to be out of New York. And there's been so many friendly people that I've met already, so it's been a great conference so far. So before I begin, I'd like to say thank you to Dennis, to Jim Porter, to Phil Duryea, and to Dave Kamensky as well for setting up this conference and for asking me to speak here before you today. And I'd like to thank each of you for coming as well. It really shows that there's an incredible amount of interest to unconventional oil and gas resources here in the United States and also more locally. And this development has numerous potential benefits relating to our national security and also to our long-term economic stability and growth. And it's some of those economic benefits that I plan on addressing in more detail today. But first, I'd like to address the depth and the scope of the potential of fossil fuel resources domestically and also more locally here in Ohio and neighboring Pennsylvania and West Virginia. And I'll go on to address why I think this region needs a new name, the butane belt. Next, I'll address the infrastructure in the region and how it's changing the landscape of natural gas. It's literally flipping the natural gas market on its head. And then I'll touch on natural gas and how it's spurring a new industrial revolution, and how there's a dichotomy in the industrial revolution between North and South. And I'll speak a little bit on the opportunity for natural gas vehicles, and there's some just out the door, but these vehicles offer potentially lower costs as well as lower greenhouse gas emissions versus their diesel counterparts. And finally, I'll address the sustainability of this renaissance. You know, the biggest question we always get is this really sustainable? We're talking about LNG exports when we were just talking about LNG imports 10 years ago. Is this all going to reverse? And I hope that by the end of this presentation that you will agree with me that yes, this movement is sustainable. So, moving on to the, what are we talking about nationally? Did I skip a slide? Yeah, okay, there we go. So it's estimated that there's about 76 years worth of natural gas in the United States, and there's billions of barrels of crude oil. Now, those numbers I didn't really give any numbers for how much unproven reserves there are. That's not because I didn't really feel like looking them up. That's because it doesn't really matter. There's a lot in the ground. But what really matters is proven resources. So how much can you get out of the ground economically and using today's technology? And the key there is that those resources, the number that we have in the ground that we can get out, keeps increasing year after year. This is largely because of technological advancement. We can do more with one rig now than we've ever been able to do in the past. We forecast that crude oil production in the United States will hit 10 million barrels a day by 2020. Normally the question I get after this is, well, are we going to be energy independent? Well, no, we will not. We'll still be importing about 5 million barrels a day of crude oil. Production right now is around 7.8 a day. We still import about 8 million a day. But contrast this forecast of 5 million barrels a day of imports versus what we were doing back in 2005. We were importing about 10 million barrels a day back then. So versus that 5 million import forecast, that's about 2.1 billion barrels of crude oil that we're displacing, that we're no longer importing. Now, aside from the economic benefits that we get from a less negative trade balance or the impacts of the current account balance, that just means that we're not that much more, that we're not as dependent on foreign production anymore. So it increases our national security. Now, what are the key plays in the United States from an oil perspective? You've got the Bakken in North Dakota. That's about 800,000 barrels a day. You've got the Permian, a still relatively under-realized formation in West Texas. And you've also got the Eagle Ford in southeast Texas. And the key natural gas and natural gas liquids plays are the Monster, which is the Marcellus, the Barnett, and right here, the Utica. And speaking of the Utica, I'd like to formally welcome all of you to what we call now the butane belt. But the Utica is still emerging. There's still a lot of unknowns. It's still a relatively new play. For instance, we forecast that there's about 1.3 to 5.5 billion barrels of crude oil in the ground in the Utica, and about 3.8 to 15.7 trillion cubic feet of natural gas. Now, those numbers are very large, but that's not really the point. Why I say it is those numbers are all over the place. I mean, this 3.8 versus 15.7, that's a big difference. The point is we still don't really know what we're getting here in the Utica. But I'm confident that producers will continue to be in this region for two reasons. One, just where it lies geographically, and that's not just meaning, okay, it happens to be closer to Chicago, but it happens to be about a few thousand feet under the Marcellus. So from a producer perspective, when you acquire the acreage for one play, you get two. So it brings down producers' costs, as well as it makes it easier from a logistical perspective. And not only that, but as technology improves, and this is something that I'll continue to talk about throughout the day, is as drilling improves, it means that our marginal cost of production goes down, which means we'll be able to produce it for less, and we'll also be able to get to areas that we never thought we could get before. So I'm pretty confident that we'll get to the upper end of that range. Now, speaking of drilling, what have we seen from a rig count perspective? If you take a look at the chart on your left, rig counts have actually come down from their highs. Well, why is this? Well, partly it's because the Utica isn't a perfect play. The crude oil that I said that is here isn't really crude oil. It's mostly condensate, which is a very, very light form of crude oil. And it's mostly natural gas liquids, including your butanes, propanes, and a lot of ethane. But it's also because of technological developments. So drillers are experimenting with tighter frac spacing, longer laterals, multiple wells per pad, and longer vertical depth. And all this means is that they can do more with one rig now than they've ever been able to do in the past. So what this does is, again, brings down your marginal cost of production. You can do more with one rig than you've ever could. And by the way, we've said you've got two plays in one here. So producers are continuing to increase their acreage in the Utica and will be here for time to come. Now, what about our production forecast here? I'm going to group the Marcellus and the Utica together because the numbers are so large. We've got about 1.5 million barrels a day of natural gas liquids by 2020, and about 24 billion cubic feet of natural gas from here, and that's 20 BCF from the Marcellus and about 4 BCF from the Utica. Those numbers are very large. We also estimate that just in the Utica, there's 30 years of drilling inventory at $4 gas, and we're not too far below $4 gas. So we do think that producers will be here in the Utica for at least 30 years. I want to pose a question real quick to the audience, and please don't feel like anybody actually needs to say an answer, but I'm hopeful that this surprises some people, as that's the point of the question. But where do you think that the highest natural gas prices were in the world on January 24th, 2013? Was it in, what order I got? Thank you. Was it in London, Boston, Kyoto, Japan, or Chicago? Well, hopefully this comes as a surprise. It was actually Boston. Okay, come on, Chicago. Okay, there you go. Boston was paying $34 per MMBTU on January 24th, 2013. That's 3 times what they were paying in London and 10 times what they were paying in slightly nearby Chicago. Now, why is this? It's for 3 reasons. 1, it gets really freaking cold in Boston. 2, production from Eastern Canada has been down recently. But more importantly, it's because of poor infrastructure. So there's a limited amount of pipeline capacity that can take the natural gas from the producing areas to Boston. And when it gets very cold out, those pipelines meet their capacity and gas prices rally. Now, there's actually 3 LNG import facilities in Boston, one of which, the Everett regasification facility, is still in operation. And so they actually have to import LNG during the winter to sustain gas demand. That's why prices were so high. And actually, the Everett facility still imports about 150 million cubic feet of liquefied natural gas just to this day. That's its average. So despite all this LNG exports, we're still actually importing LNG into the United States. It's not because production isn't high. It's because infrastructure has not caught up with the movements that we've seen. So what are we doing about this? Well, not surprisingly, we're going to take natural gas from where we're producing it, which is now all of a sudden Marcellus and the Utica, and we're going to send it to those higher demand regions. Why? Because, well, as we discover, there's a higher price there. So this is the current flow of natural gas in the United States. The red arrows are current pipeline movements. So this region in Ohio, Pennsylvania, New York, Chicago, we import from the Rockies, we import from the south, and we import from Boston. Now, because of that 24 billion cubic feet of production that I talked about, We're literally flipping the natural gas on its head, or natural gas market on its head, sorry. So what are we going to see? We've got 39 pipeline projects planned to completely reverse the flow of natural gas. This area will now be exporting natural gas to Chicago, to Boston, and even back down to the south. So this area will not only be self-sustaining, but will be exporting. We forecast that because of the influx of production in this region, that prices here will actually average 50 cents to $1 below that of Henry Hub. Henry Hub's a benchmark in Louisiana for natural gas. Prices are already 25 cents under. So we think that they can be even weaker. We've got about 1 billion cubic feet a day of pipeline expansions reaching out to Chicago, another 1 billion cubic feet a day of planned expansions to Sarnia and into Canada, 3 billion cubic feet a day into New York City and to Boston. So those high price premiums you talked about, that $34 per MMBTU, that'll no longer exist. We're even talking about exporting it down to the south, 1 billion cubic feet back down to where it came from. Now there's also at least 4 natural gas liquids pipelines that are planned, 3 of which will take ethane out of the region. Mariner West, Mariner East connects it to Marcus Hook, the export facility, and then ATEX down south. Bluegrass will take Y-grade. Y-grade is unprocessed natural gas liquids. And talking a little bit about ethane, ethane is a really interesting subject in this region. Ethane makes up so much of the natural gas liquid stream, upwards of 40%, that prices here have fallen so much that it's only a few cents above natural gas. And you're not getting paid as a producer to strip out the ethane from the natural gas stream. So what you're doing is, as a producer, if you can, you're leaving it in the natural gas stream. What this is called is ethane rejection. So you're not getting paid to strip it out, you leave it in, even though it's technically a higher netback product. And we estimate that this is actually increasing the level of natural gas production in the region by 300 million cubic feet a day. And we actually estimate that ethane prices and the ability to get ethane out of the region is so constrained that we'll continue rejecting ethane into the natural gas stream through 2014. And I want to also highlight who we think are the real winners from all this development. Right now, what you're seeing is MarkWest is definitely a big winner. They're investing heavily in their Houston, Pennsylvania facility, and I love that name, Houston, because we get to make things much more confusing in this market. And that's a natural gas processing plant. And they also have an ethane fractionator there, too. And then also, just really, when you're talking about natural gas prices that are going to be 50 cents to $1 cheaper, already a quarter cheaper than Henry Hub, end user industrial demand in this region will certainly benefit from those lower energy prices. But what else are we doing about this? We talked about that there's lower prices. I skipped ahead. There's lower prices nationally. Well, you've mentioned that there was a mini industrial revolution, and that certainly is happening. We see about $85 billion of planned expansions and new projects through 2018. And I want to illustrate that right now that my analysis here does exclude the impact of LNG exports, as I don't really count that as an end user demand. So this is really just industrial demand. So that's $85 billion by 2018. Now, not all of those projects are going to be actually going to be completed, but at least we're seeing the interest there. But there's a big dichotomy. What we're seeing is, where is all that money going? And 50 billion of that is going to the Gulf states, states like Texas and Louisiana. How much do you have in this region? 3 billion. That's it. I mean, that's a great number. I'll take it, right? I'll take $3 billion, but it's not 50. Well, why is that? Well, Texas and Louisiana, they've been doing this for decades, right? They know what they're doing. They've got the infrastructure in place. They have the refining capacity. And it's so much easier to start a brownfield project than it is a greenfield project. But what is, and I also want to illustrate what happens when you try to plug $50 billion of investment into a very small region. Well, inflation's likely to happen. Now, what happened in Australia? I'm going to try to draw a parallel between Australia's LNG export boom and what we're going to see in the Gulf. In Australia, when you got all these LNG export facilities all being constructed at the same time, the ability to find skilled labor was just tough. So projects went way over their budgets, and projects also could not get completed on time. So we're talking about LNG export facilities in Australia that cost somewhere of $10 billion. Well, now they're up to $20 billion. ExxonMobil is building a $52 billion export facility in Australia. Now, those numbers are big, but yes, those projects are a little bit more complex. They're floating LNG facilities, so they're different than what we have here. But it does highlight what happens when you try to build a lot of things at the same time. And what are we doing in the Gulf? We've got all these projects coming online. Though I haven't even mentioned the LNG exports yet that are being planned in the United States. There's 4 projects that have been approved by the Department of Energy for non-free trade agreement exports. That means that they can export LNG to the big demand countries like Japan. There's one that's been approved up here, well, relatively up here in the Chesapeake, Dominion Cove Point, and that's for a relatively small amount of 0.77 billion cubic feet a day. And I actually think the Dominion Cove Point's a great project. It's a brownfield facility. It's actually an import facility right now. And they have advantage by having lower natural gas prices than Henry Hub. As we established, it'll be about 50 cents to $1 cheaper here. Whereas you've got three projects right now that have been approved that are under construction in the Gulf, 2 of which are located on the Texas-Louisiana border in Lake Charles, and 1 is in Freeport, Texas. And there's also a lot of planned LNG facilities. So the number is greater than 50 billion down there, and they're all building at the same time. This is all planned through 2018. So they're already seeing a scarcity of skilled labor in the region. There's companies that are instituting schools just to get employees up to speed. It's only going to get worse down there. So what does that mean for this region? It means that this region's got spare capacity. This region certainly has the ability to expand and grow, and certainly the ability to capitalize on low natural gas prices. But that doesn't mean there's not good and encouraging stories from this region. There certainly is. Toyota invested $815 million in a Lexus production plant in Kentucky, and then more locally, just down the road in Worcester, there was $116 million built for a new sour cream facility. And Potash is investing in a new ammonia plant in Lima, Ohio. So all these industries use a significant amount of natural gas, especially in ammonia fertilizer. So there's certainly good stories, but I also do want to highlight that, and Joe and I were talking about this last night, there's not a single ethane cracker planned for the region. Shell was thinking about it, and I still think it's on the table, but they can't get supplies from producers. So there certainly are challenges to this. But I think that there's certainly an opportunity in this region to develop ethylene crackers, as well as perhaps even methanol expansions. So as of right now, it certainly is apparent that the butane belt is under-realizing its potential. So we talked a little bit about industrial demand and planned expansions, and what are we talking about for natural gas vehicles? We've got a few trucks outside, which is pretty cool, just because I like trucks. But Ford introduced a version of its F-150 that can run on compressed natural gas. And, you know, I've been a big skeptic of compressed natural gas, and I was talking to Chuck Deal last night, and he told me I need to think twice about this, and perhaps I do. I've always said that compressed natural gas, well, you're never going to see a truck drive across the country on it, because it's got too limited of a range and it takes up too much darn space. But he's got a truck that can go off, that has a 700-mile range. He's also selling it publicly, so if you need compressed natural gas, I would talk to Chuck. So that said, compressed natural gas certainly has its applications. It's great for a short-range fleet that can come back to a centralized refueling hub, and it's certainly great for city buses. But once again, as of right now, I'm still a little bit skeptical. Chuck, sorry, I'll let you prove me wrong. But I still don't think you're going to go across the country with it. But what about LNG? Can we put LNG in a truck? Well, yeah, we can. Cummins Westport introduced a dual-fueled engine that can run off of both diesel and LNG. So, do the economics work? Well, I've got a little box up there that shows how much it costs to get a gallon of LNG versus a gallon of diesel. And there's one little intricacy about LNG that we need to talk about first. It doesn't have the same energy that diesel does, so you can't buy 1 gallon of LNG and expect to get the same out of it as you would in 1 gallon of diesel. It's about 1.7 times more LNG that you need versus diesel. So that number up there takes that into account. It takes a little bit of the energy conversion into account. So it's about $1.30 right now cheaper than diesel prices. So assuming that your truck costs $70,000 and you're burning through 30,000 gallons a year, And I don't know, I don't drive a truck, so that could be really aggressive or not aggressive enough. I'll let others make judgment on that. But it'd take about 2 years to repay the cost of that vehicle. So certainly the economics work out. But the biggest question is infrastructure. How are you going to drive across the country if you can't refuel the darn thing? Well, Flying J has invested in about 100 stations to have LNG refueling capabilities, and by the end of the year they plan 50 more. Shell and Travel Center also plans to have 300 LNG fueling stations by 2015. So by 2015, you will be able to drive across the country in an LNG truck, assuming that you stay to major highways. Well, what are the challenges? Some of the challenges that might surprise people are taxes. Taxes for fuel are charged on a volumetric basis, which means it's the same tax rate that you would have for diesel for 1 gallon. But because you've already established that you need to have 1.7 times the amount of LNG in your vehicle to take it 700 miles as would a diesel vehicle, you pay 1.7 times the amount of taxes. And also because the vehicle itself costs $70,000 more, and that's just a broad estimate, you're paying that much more in taxes as well. So there has been a movement by those, the powers that be in D.C. to take care of this, to make it more cost-effective to buy an LNG vehicle. But they can't really seem to agree to much of anything, so I don't think that we're going to get anywhere on that relatively soon. But there's also environmental concerns. We all know that natural gas, the burning of it, has significantly lower greenhouse gas emissions than diesel. But what we don't all talk about is what happens when you release the methane, which is what natural gas is, directly into the atmosphere without burning it first. And that's significantly worse for the environment than burning of diesel or the burning of even coal. So there needs to be more studies done on what happens when you refuel the vehicle to make sure that there's not a significant amount of methane being released into the environment. And also, filling up the vehicle is a little bit more difficult than just filling up your truck, either with CNG or even with diesel. First off, LNG is just very cold, so you do risk getting burns from it. So you actually need a specialized individual to refuel your truck. So under very bullish scenarios, you could actually see 6 billion cubic feet a day of transport demand. 3.8 of that would come from LNG in heavy trucks. Those are probably a little too bullish. It'll probably take a little bit longer than we expect to catch on, but we still see significant demand opportunities in the natural gas vehicle market. But we're not just done with heavy trucks. What can we see in the locomotive space? And we certainly have seen headlines of BNSF investing in LNG-fueled locomotives, but we actually think that LNG entry into the locomotive market is a little bit more challenged. First off, a locomotive just has a higher cost and a longer shelf life, so you're taking what we call spread risk, the difference between LNG and diesel, for a lot longer than you would on a heavy truck. And there's also a little bit of a quirk with the Federal Railroad Administration. They regulate the commodity that can be directly behind a locomotive. And last I checked, that LNG cannot be directly behind the locomotive, so it has to actually be 5 or 6 cars behind. And this creates issues just from getting the LNG from the fuel tank to the locomotive, because it has to travel over 5 or 6 cars. So that creates safety concerns as well as logistical concerns. But the crashworthiness of LNG tankers definitely seems safe. But then there's also the issue with all the crude, the trains derailing carrying crude, specifically 2 incidents in Canada. So I think that there might be a little bit of backlash from government and perhaps the public regarding LNG and trains. But moving on, what else do we like? With all this demand that we have, we've got demand in trucks and locomotives perhaps, industrial demand and piping it out of the region. Is all this really sustainable? You know, LNG imports were the craze 10 years ago. Are we going to go back to this? And I think no. And let me tell you why. First off, for the first time ever, fun little fact, production in the Northeast is now greater than demand. First time ever. Why is that? Well, that's because it's October, and aside from today, it hasn't been very cold, so demand is seasonally low. Once winter happens, we're going to go back to being a net importer. So, but over the long run, by 2020, when we're producing 24 billion cubic feet a day, well, how much greater of demand is that? Well, it's actually, we think that that's a 7 billion cubic feet a day overhang. So production is greater than demand by 7 billion cubic feet a day. And that demand forecast is including an impact from all the industrial plant expansions that we have in the region, the LNG export facility in Dominion Cove Point, and an increase from power generation as well. So we definitely think that it's sustainable. What about during the cold months? Just to illustrate how sustainable this is, even when peak demand during the winter occurs, we're still producing more than we demand in this region by about 1 to 1.5 billion cubic feet a day by 2020. So is this sustainable? Yes, it is. Those technological advancements that we talked about will ensure that drilling will continue to be here in the region, and we should hit this target. As a matter of fact, we think we're too conservative on this production target. We think that we could actually be significantly above this. So we also think that, 150 years ago, oil was first drilled in Titusville, Pennsylvania. And with technology advancing like the way it is, there's certainly no reason why we can't be here in another 50 years. So to wrap things up, and then we'll have some questions after. In conclusion, while the development of unconventional oil and gas drilling is a national phenomenon, the positive impact to local communities cannot be understated. The Utica and the Ohio region in particular, long-term production of natural gas and natural gas liquids positively impacts the economy in and of itself. But low natural gas prices also provides a cost advantage to energy-intensive industries, giving American manufacturers a competitive edge over global counterparts. And with 30 years of drilling inventory, enabled by ongoing technological advancement, continued infrastructure investment, spare capacity for local industries to invest and to grow, the future looks nothing like this region's Rust Belt past. The butane belt likely doesn't do this region or the movement justice, but I'd rest assured that Ohio's future burns nothing but bright. So with that, I think we'll open up to some questions.
You about some of the risks to your production forecast. I'm always curious about whether gas becomes too cheap to produce and whether that discourages everything we're trying to do. And maybe you can talk about production forecasts and what might affect them.
Sure. Well, there's a couple different risks to the production forecast. And first and foremost, and this might seem a little bit odd, the production forecast is heavily dependent upon WTI prices, so that's West Texas Intermediate crude oil prices. And I'll touch on natural gas in just a second. But this largely stems from the natural gas liquids that most producers are trying to get out of the ground in this region. Those natural gas liquids, which include ethane, propane, butane, and natural gasoline/condensate, come at a significantly higher premium to natural gas, with the exception of ethane, which producers certainly don't want. So those prices are still slightly linked to WTI. So if WTI prices collapse, then those prices will also come down, and that means that the internal rate of return that producers are realizing on these plays declines, and then there's risks that production could be, production won't really be shut in, but new drilling won't go on. That price right now are around 90 or 95, I think, on WTI. So that price needs to come down significantly, probably close to 70 before we start to really get concerned. But if we keep rising, if production keeps rising as much as we forecast, then it certainly becomes a risk in the crude oil market there. Now, speaking specifically to natural gas, there certainly is a risk that natural gas prices could fall significantly again, like we did in April of 2012 when we hit $1.90, and then we see a producer response. But let's just take a minute and step back. What type of producer response did we see in April? Did we see producers start shutting in? No. They just started reallocating their drills to another area. Once again, those more natural gas liquids plays. What these guys want is cash flow, and that's what they need. They need to drill, they need to get the stuff out of the ground so they can generate cash flow. So they're not going to shut in a well, almost regardless of the price. And the prices need to fall a lot more than they used to. I was talking to a producer in this area about 2 years ago, and he said that his marginal cost of production in the Marcellus was $1.50. And that's pretty low. So we've got a significant room to fall in this region before we get really concerned about producers stop drilling in this area. And that was a couple years ago, and with the development that we've seen in drilling technology, that price is probably even lower. So,
can you talk a little bit about liquid natural gas exports and how important are they in order to maintain a good price for the whole economy, for the producers?
Yeah, you know, so far we've got a little bit more in exports than I had anticipated up to this point from the Department of Energy. I thought they were going to drag their heels a little bit more, so I was surprised when they announced their fourth export facility back in September. You know, I'm not totally convinced that LNG exports is going to become this next great big thing. Right now, we've got about 10% of production that's allowed to be exported to non-FTA countries. I don't know how much more that the government's going to allow, maybe up to 10 billion cubic feet a day. Right now, we're around 6.7. So I think that there's enough that LNG exports doesn't really totally matter to producers. I mean, obviously, they want to see it. They want to get their gas out. I mean, when you take a look at the natural gas prices that we still have in Japan, where they're still paying upwards of $15 per MMBTU, you just want to get your gas to that market if you can. But LNG exporting is very expensive. It's very energy intensive. You use a lot of natural gas in the process. So it's not the easiest thing to do. And when there's going to be a lot of LNG export competition, not just from Australia or Morocco or Trinidad, but also from Mozambique. They've got a significant amount of gas that should be coming online. Anadarko's CFO told me that he thinks that everything's going to work swimmingly there and that the government's not going to get in the way. But, I mean, it probably will because it's government. But so when you've got all this coming online and then U.S. LNG exports coming online all at the same time, I'm a little bit concerned that LNG prices normalize to Henry Hub and that LNG exports don't end up becoming this big bullish thing to natural gas prices, that all that it does is just bring LNG prices down.
Okay. You've talked about production estimates, and you've talked about size of investment. Can you translate that into jobs projections?
Yeah, and this is the one. So we've done significant research on this, and now I have to say first and foremost, this isn't assuming like a multiplier effect, and what I mean by that is we just look at the jobs that are created when you build an LNG export project, or the jobs that are created from this significant increase in production that we've seen. So I don't go further in this estimate than just that. So it doesn't take into account, well, low natural gas prices spurs a sour cream facility in Worcester or a new Lexus production plant. It doesn't go into those types of multipliers. But the unfortunate thing is that it actually does not create a whole lot of jobs. It creates a lot of temporary jobs in construction, but long-term jobs, it doesn't create that much. We saw something along the numbers of maybe 40, 50,000 jobs, which sounds big, but from where I sit, we're talking about the national economy, and you're talking about the economy just added about 150,000 jobs last month. And you talk about over the next 5 years, we're adding 40,000 jobs. That's actually not as much as we'd like to see. Just from a production and drilling perspective, it's not it's not a labor-intensive industry. And actually, I was here back in June visiting some rigs that Gulfport was having in southeast Texas, and I found funny because I saw more cowboy boots than I thought I would have seen. They're not hiring people from here; they're importing them from Texas, folks that do know and grew up oilmen.
Okay. Our next speaker is going to be talking about ethane, and I'm curious about what has to happen to the ethane market so that it's not just poured into the natural gas stream, that it becomes valuable enough to segregate in a big way and send to market.
Yeah, and well, first and foremost, we need takeaway capacity, and that's what the Mariner West, Mariner East, ATEX, and Bluegrass pipelines do. They connect to this region with where you can actually either export it or other demand regions. Sorry. And so where are we sending it to? The ATEX and the Bluegrass, they're sending the ethane down to Mont Belvieu in Texas. And I don't know if anybody's ever been to Mont Belvieu, but it has a very distinct smell. It smells like a lot of hydrocarbons. And trust me, it's completely safe. Don't worry about it if you ever go. But it wasn't built there because there was a lot of fractionation capacity. It was built there because, the ethane was sent there because it's built on a giant salt dome. So you can easily store it. And that's what Shell's getting into the problem with this ethane cracker that was planning in northwest Pennsylvania, is it can't get producers to say, hey, I want to sell you my ethane. They want to send it down to Mont Belvieu because they've got the storage capacity and they've got multiple fractionators. The issue with Shell is if that one fractionator goes offline and you're an ethane producer, what are you going to do with your ethane? You don't have firm commitment on the pipeline, so you get stranded with it. There's nothing you can do with it. Now, in regards to the ethane rejection, which I talked about, in regards to sending it into a natural gas pipeline, well, there's limits to that as well. Ethane is a richer / wetter gas than natural gas. What it means is it has a higher BTU content. It burns at a higher temperature. So pipelines have restrictions on how much ethane, how rich or wet the gas can be, not only because it could blow up the power plant on the other end, but two, it could really ruin the pipeline. As a matter of fact, there's so much liquids coming out of some of these plays that they have to constantly pig the pipeline. And what that means is you shove, well, it's not an actual animal, it's called a pig, and I don't really know what it stands for, but it cleans out the pipe, and it literally takes all water, condensate, and other natural gas liquids, and it forces it out of the pipeline. It's like a clogged artery. It's bad for the pipeline. So there's pipeline specifications that you have to meet. So there's certain limitations to this ethane rejection. That's why it's at this 300 million cubic feet a day, and it can't really go up significantly from there, dependent on pipeline additions.
We would have time for one or two questions from the audience. Does anyone have one? Over here. Let me do this the brute force method.
So the question was, do you need multiple maintenance or garages to be able to work on a LNG vehicle versus a diesel vehicle or a dual engine, and any risk of explosions? LNG is actually not flammable in its liquid form until you get up to like 1,000 degrees. So there's not really a risk that LNG can actually blow up. What's more at risk is that it just goes poof. It just evaporates. It's called boil off because it literally is boiling, and it goes into the atmosphere and gets released. So there's not a whole lot of risk that it actually blows up. I haven't really done a whole lot of research on to the mechanisms between perhaps repairing an engine and how you have to have a mechanic who knows how to work on both. But that certainly does seem like a challenge that the LNG vehicles would have to face.
Join me in thanking Kevin Little from J.P. Morgan Chase.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. I appreciate it so much.